Imagine inheriting, on your very first day in office, the power to end civilization as we know it, not metaphorically, not theoretically, but with a single command, backed by thousands of nuclear warheads pointed at cities across the globe. On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, at just 43 years old, became the youngest elected president in American history, and within hours of taking the oath of office, he was handed a briefcase, a set of codes, and the weight of a nuclear arsenal so vast, so terrifying, that even the men who built it struggled to comprehend its full destructive potential. But Kennedy didn't just accept those codes and move on. He asked questions. Deeply unsettling, deeply urgent questions. And one of them, perhaps the most haunting of all, was directed straight at the man who had just handed him the keys to the most powerful military machine ever assembled, Dwight David Eisenhower. If this story is already making your pulse quicken, you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who thinks they know everything about the Cold War. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of history that textbooks leave out. And when you finish watching, drop a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The story cannot be understood without first understanding the world Kennedy stepped into. By 1961, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in a terrifying nuclear standoff for over a decade. The arms race that had begun in the late 1940s accelerated dramatically after the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. That single explosion shattered the American monopoly on nuclear weapons and changed the geopolitical landscape of the world forever. President Harry Truman, stunned by the news, immediately authorized the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon exponentially more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The Cold War had just entered a terrifying new chapter, and there was no going back. Under Eisenhower, who served as president from January 1953 to January 1961, the United States pursued a nuclear strategy known as massive retaliation. The doctrine, articulated by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles in January 1954, essentially promised that any Soviet aggression, conventional or otherwise, would be met with an overwhelming nuclear response. This strategy was, at its core, a gamble. It assumed that the sheer terror of nuclear annihilation would deter the Soviets from ever acting aggressively. And for a time, it appeared to work. But beneath the surface of that fragile stability, American military planners had been quietly, methodically, and with chilling efficiency, building one of the most elaborate weapons infrastructures in human history. By the time Eisenhower left office, the United States possessed thousands of nuclear warheads deployed across land, sea, and air, ready to be launched at a moment's notice. What Kennedy discovered in his first weeks in office would have shaken any man. He was given access to classified briefings that revealed the true scope of American nuclear capabilities and the plans for using them. The document that disturbed him most was something called the Single Integrated Operational Plan, known by the chilling acronym SIOP. Finalized in December 1960, just weeks before Kennedy took office, SIOP 62 was the United States master plan for nuclear war. It called for a massive, simultaneous strike against the Soviet Union, China, and their allies using every available nuclear weapon. The targets numbered in the hundreds: cities, military installations, industrial centers. The estimated death toll in the first strikes alone was staggering. Some military analysts projected that a full execution of SIOP 62 could kill as many as 600 million people. 600 million human beings. Kennedy reportedly went pale when he read those numbers. It was in this context, surrounded by generals, burdened by briefings, and haunted by numbers that defied human comprehension, that Kennedy reached out to Eisenhower. The two men met at the White House on January 19, 1961, the day before the inauguration, for a formal transition briefing. They spoke about Cuba, about Laos, about the broader state of the Cold War. But Kennedy carried with him a question that had been burning since he first began receiving intelligence briefings as president-elect. He had been told that the United States had, at that moment, roughly 1,000 nuclear warheads available for immediate use. And you wanted to know he needed to know whether Eisenhower, the man who had overseen 8 years of nuclear buildup, believed that number was right, necessary, or even sane. It was not merely a logistical question. It was a moral one. Eisenhower's answer was measured, but revealing. The former Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, the man who had overseen the liberation of Europe, was not a reckless militarist. In fact, in his farewell address on January 17, 1961, just 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration, Eisenhower had delivered one of the most prescient warnings in American political history. He cautioned the nation about what he called the military-industrial complex, warning that the growing entanglement of defense contractors, military planners, and political interests posed a grave threat to democratic governance. It was a stunning admission from a 5-star general and 2-term president, and it gave Kennedy's question an even deeper resonance. If even Eisenhower was warning about the dangers of unchecked military power, what did that say about the arsenal he was leaving behind? The number 1,000 was not arbitrary. It reflected years of production at facilities like the Pantex plant in Amarillo, Texas, and the Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where nuclear weapons components were assembled with industrial precision. By 1961, the American nuclear arsenal was not just a military tool. It was an entire ecosystem, employing tens of thousands of scientists, engineers, and military personnel. The warheads were carried by B-52 Stratofortress bombers of the Strategic Air Command, based at dozens of airfields across the United States and overseas. They were loaded onto Titan I intercontinental ballistic missiles, which had achieved initial operational capability in April 1962. They were being prepared for deployment aboard Polaris submarines, the first of which, the USS George Washington, had successfully launched a Polaris A-1 missile from submerged position in July 1960. The United States had built a nuclear triad, and it was loaded and ready. If you are watching this and feeling the weight of what these men were dealing with, pause for a second and think about the human beings behind these decisions. Right now, at the midpoint of this story, we want to ask you to do something meaningful. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Give this video a like and share it with a friend, a colleague, or a family member who loves history. Leave us a comment below. Tell us what you find most chilling about this moment in history. Your engagement helps us keep making content that digs beneath the surface of the events that shaped our world. Now, back to 1961. Kennedy was not satisfied with simply inheriting a strategy he hadn't designed. In the spring of 1961, he tasked his Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara, with conducting a thorough review of American nuclear policy. McNamara, a former president of Ford Motor Company and a man of extraordinary analytical intelligence, threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. What he found horrified him. The military had developed targeting plans that were, in his own words, insane. There was massive redundancy, multiple warheads assigned to the same targets, plans that would guarantee the complete destruction of the Soviet Union, China, and every Soviet-aligned nation, regardless of whether those nations had participated in any aggression. There was no flexibility, no graduated response, no room for diplomacy once the button was pressed. It was annihilation as policy. The pressure on Kennedy intensified dramatically on April 12, 1961, when Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space, completing one full orbit of the Earth aboard Vostok 1. The achievement was a propaganda triumph for the Soviet Union and a devastating blow to American prestige. Then came the Bay of Pigs, the catastrophically failed CIA-backed invasion of Cuba on April 17, 1961, which left Kennedy humiliated on the world stage and deeply suspicious of the military and intelligence establishment he had inherited. And looming over all of it was Berlin, where Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was threatening to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would effectively cut off Western access to the divided city. Every crisis, every failure, every threat carried with it the shadow of nuclear escalation. Kennedy felt it in every meeting, every briefing, every sleepless night in the White House. The Vienna Summit of June 3rd and 4th, 1961, brought Kennedy and Khrushchev face to face for the first and only time. The meeting was brutal for Kennedy. Khrushchev, a shrewd and relentless negotiator who had survived Stalin's purges and risen to lead the Soviet Empire, tested Kennedy mercilessly. He threatened, lectured, and dismissed the young American president with barely concealed contempt. Kennedy returned to Washington shaken and privately admitted to journalist James Reston that it had been the worst meeting of his life. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that the nuclear standoff was not an abstraction. It was a living, breathing confrontation between two men, two systems, two visions of the world, and one miscalculation could end everything. The question about those 1,000 warheads had never felt more urgent. In the months that followed Vienna, Kennedy and McNamara began the painstaking process of reforming American nuclear strategy. In July 1961, McNamara presented a new framework that would eventually replace the rigid all-or-nothing approach of SIOP 62 with something called flexible response, a graduated system of military options that would allow the United States to respond to aggression at various levels without immediately triggering nuclear war. Kennedy embraced the concept wholeheartedly. It aligned with his deeply held belief, articulated again and again in private meetings, that nuclear weapons should be a last resort, not a first answer. He was wrestling in real time with what it meant to hold ultimate power responsibly, and that wrestling produced genuine, consequential changes in American strategic doctrine. But the crisis Kennedy feared most was still coming. On October 16, 1962, CIA analysts presented Kennedy with two reconnaissance photographs showing Soviet medium-range ballistic missile installations under construction in Cuba. For 13 days, from October 16 to October 28, 1962, the world stood closer to nuclear war than it ever had before or has since. The Cuban Missile Crisis tested every lesson Kennedy had learned since that January morning when he first asked Eisenhower about those 1,000 warheads. He resisted military pressure to launch airstrikes. He chose a naval blockade. He communicated with Khrushchev through back channels, through intermediaries, through careful and deliberate diplomacy. And on October 28th, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American pledge not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The world exhaled. What Kennedy's question to Eisenhower reveals, ultimately, is something profound about the nature of power and the burden of leadership. He did not ask because he doubted the competence of the men who had built the arsenal. He asked because he understood that knowledge, real knowledge, requires courage, the courage to look directly at the most terrifying realities and demand honest answers. He asked because he was a young man who had seen war firsthand in the Pacific, who had watched men die, who understood in his bones that weapons are not abstractions. He asked because he suspected correctly that the machinery of deterrence had grown so vast, so complex, and so deeply embedded in American policy that no single human being fully understood it anymore. And that terrified him more than the warheads themselves. History remembers John F. Kennedy for many things: his eloquence, his charisma, his tragic assassination on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. But perhaps his most important legacy is this: he stared into the abyss of nuclear annihilation and chose, again and again, to ask the harder question. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about the men who held the fate of the world in their hands, then please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who deserves to know this history. Leave a comment below and tell us, what did you learn today that you never knew before? Your curiosity is what keeps history alive.